Hello, I'm Graham and I hope everyone's having a great day, and welcome to episode 4 of this new series I've created for beginners to the FZ300 330 camera from Panasonic. Now in this series we've been looking at how to use the camera without going into too much technical information. In the first episode we saw how to use the IA mode and how to modulate that by using the IA Plus mode, so we got a little bit more control over how the camera responds. Then we moved into the first of the semi-automatic modes and we looked at the program auto. Now I liken that to the ISO priority mode. Now in today's video we're going to look at two other priority modes, one the aperture priority mode and the other the shutter priority mode. When you select aperture priority mode, you're telling the camera you want to use a specific aperture to create a specific look in your particular image. Dependent on the ISO, the camera will then set a shutter speed to give you the correct exposure. Now the aperture governs the amount of light that reaches the sensor, but it also creates a depth of field or amount of focus between the foreground and the background, hence we call it the depth of field. Now the depth of field will depend on the aperture and also on the focal length of the lens. So the combination of the two of those, you can create some very interesting pictures with either a very shallow depth of field, such as if you were taking a portrait, you could have just the eyes and nose in focus. With landscape photography, it's converse. We want as much depth of field in that picture as possible. So it's tradition to use a wide angle setting and a smaller aperture, and then you'll get the maximum depth of field. If you choose shutter priority mode, you're signaling to the camera that you want a specific shutter speed, either to create some subject motion, such as for waterfalls, or you want to arrest any subject motion, perhaps for birds in flight or in sports photography. Now here in the studio I've got a situation where I want to create a picture of these characters and I want to create two images. One where we've got very shallow depth of field, so we've only got one of these characters in focus. And again, I want to create another image where they're all in focus. So I'll show you two techniques for creating the shallow depth of field and the extended depth of field. We're going to be shooting in the aperture priority mode. So to gain aperture priority mode, turn the top control dial until the A is opposite the white index mark on the flash housing. And you'll notice that we get the A symbol on the LCD display to tell us we're in aperture priority mode. Now, as we did in the program auto mode, I've set the manual white balance to give me the correct white balance in my studio lights. I'm shooting at ISO 100 and that's the lowest ISO this camera provides. That will give me the lowest noise in the image and also gives me the most dynamic range, or the range of colours from highlights to shadows. The first image I want to shoot at f2.8, and f2.8 is the widest aperture the camera has. So that will give me the shallowest depth of field. So I'm going to select an aperture of 2.8 by turning the top control dial, which then allows me to change that aperture down to f2.8. You can see that the camera will be using a shutter speed of 1/40th of a second. So if I was hand holding, that would be fine, but I've got it mounted on this little tripod so I can keep the shots consistent from shot to shot. I've also set up the single area autofocus, and I've got the single point and I've got it set to the smallest size, and we did that in the program auto mode. So it means I can change the position of the target by using a touch screen, or I can use the navigation dial after we press the function 2 button. So for the first shot I'll use function 2, which then brings up the target and its position. I'll position the focus on the first of the 7 characters in this image. So you can see I've got an indicator here which reminds me I'm in f2.8 mode. So I'll set the 2-second timer so we don't get any camera shake as it goes off. I'm also in the electronic shutter mode, so that will also reduce the amount of vibration when the camera shutter fires. So let's take that first image. And we can review that in the video, but we notice we've got the first image very sharp and then it progressively falls off towards the background, the amount of sharpness we have. I'll now change over to f8 so we can then see the amount of depth of field based on the same character but using the smaller aperture. So first of all I'll change up to f8. you now notice that the exposure has gone to 1/5 of a second. So I'll turn around the indicator to remind me. And again, I'll use a 2-second timer. You can now see we've got much more depth of field, or more focus from foreground to background. Now, even though we focused on the front character, the camera lens always gives us depth of field, and there's about 1/3 of it before the focus point and about 2/3 of it after the focus point. So if we focused here on the first character, it means that we've lost some depth of field to the front of the image that we could have used in achieving a much better focus throughout the rest of the character set. So what I'm going to do now is not focus on the first character, but I'm going to focus on the third character, which is 1/3 of the way down this group of 7. So I'll change my focus point to this third character down the way. Again, I'll use the touchscreen this time to set my focus point. So I've set the focus point on the third character, and again I'll use that f8 aperture and the 2-second timer to take this shot. And now you can see our first character is still sharp, and the last character is even sharper. So we've got a lot more depth of field because we focus at what's called the hyperfocal point. So we've got 1/3 of the image in focus to the subject and 2/3 behind. So if we were to measure this, you'll find that our character is in focus with 1/3 of the image to the front and 2/3 of the image to the rear. So if you shoot in the landscape, don't focus on infinity, focus on about 1/3 of the way into your subject, and you'll get the maximum depth of field. So let's just look at that with the f2.8 aperture. So I'll convert this to f2.8. Turn the indicator around to remind me, and again using that 2-second timer to take this shot. And you can see we've got a reduced amount of depth of field, and it's centered around that third character. So we've got the second character just slightly in focus, and we've got the fourth and the fifth character in focus because of this 1/3, 2/3 relationship. I'll now focus on the final character in the set. So again, I'll use the touch screen and to set the focus point there, and we'll still use the f2.8 aperture, and I'll take that shot. Again, we'll have 1/3 of the image in front of this character focus, so we should see the 6th and possibly the 5th character in focus, but we've lost that amount of depth of field behind that we could have gained. So we'll now change to f8 and see just how much in front we get. So in set f8, I'll turn my indicator around to remind me, and we'll take that shot again with that last character in focus. And you can see we've got a lot more in depth of field coming towards, but we could have got more depth of field by focusing 1/3 of the way into the subject, which would have been that third character in this case. Now, as with the program auto mode, if I thought the image was slightly underexposed or slightly overexposed, I can use exposure value compensation to make that change. By pressing the function 1 button, you see that we bring up the EV scale, and I can change the brightness by going plus to make it brighter or minus to make it darker. So if I felt the image was slightly underexposed, too dark, I can make it brighter by going towards the plus side. And if we again take that picture, you can see it's slightly brighter. So that was the aperture priority mode. We'll now shoot in the shutter priority mode, and to gain the shutter priority mode, turn the top control dial until the S is opposite the white marker on the flash housing, and again you'll get verification with the S appearing on screen. Now the top control dial will vary the shutter speed for me. If I select a shutter speed, for instance now 1/50th of a second, if I have to press the shutter button, the camera will tell me the aperture that it's got to select. You notice it's selected f2.8, but the aperture and the shutter speed are both flashing red, which means the camera can't control that exposure. And if you notice, when I have to press the shutter button, you notice the image goes darker, which means the camera is underexposing. So to make the exposure correct, I can either change my ISO if I wanted to use that particular shutter speed, or as I want to keep the ISO to 100, I need to lengthen the exposure to make that subject brighter. So I'm going to go from 1/50th down to 1/40th, and you notice on the exposure scale 1/40th is still in the red band, so I need to go until we have the aperture opposite a grey point on the shutter speed dial. So here at 1/30th, it's just inside the control. If I went down to a 25th, you'll see that a 25th is well into the aperture range, and it's actually now going to move the aperture up from f2.8 to f4. So if I wanted f2.8 for the shallow depth of field, then I need to be using a 30th of a second or a 25th to get the exposure. So if I take that picture with a self timer, we'll get the correct exposure. Well, that's it for this short video. I hope you did find that useful. Of course, if you're a new viewer to the channel, please do hit that subscribe button, and if you want notification of when I upload the next part of this series, click that little bell icon by the side, and then you'll be notified when I do upload that video. Of course, if you've not already downloaded the guidebook for this series, it's available on my photographic blog, and I'm going to put a link to that in the video description below. It does assume that you've set the camera back to camera defaults and set some of the menu items the way that I particularly like to set the camera up. It means then if we do any changes to the camera, you'll be able to see the results without wondering why you're not achieving what you should be achieving if you've not got the same settings that we have. So until the next video, where I'm going to be looking at filters and macro lenses for this camera, then we'll be looking in the final episode at the use of video with the camera, how to set up for video, some of the accessories you might need, and how to create good video with good sound for recording. So until then, thanks again for watching, please do take care, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.